When you picture climate migration, um, I'm willing to bet a very specific, almost cinematic image comes to mind.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Usually something pretty catastrophic.
Exactly. You see these catastrophic floods, you see tsunamis, you picture like Category 5 hurricanes tearing the roofs off of homes, apocalyptic storm surges, and entire communities just wading through chest-high, muddy water, carrying whatever they could save in a plastic bag.
It's the standard evening news footage. I mean, it's the imagery we've all been completely conditioned to look for when we think about the natural world forcing human beings to abandon their homes.
Right. It's violent, it's loud, and most importantly, it is highly, highly visible.
It triggers an immediate visceral reaction because, well, the destruction is undeniable. You can literally point a camera at it.
But what if I told you that that image, that completely intuitive, obvious picture we all have in our heads is actually a dangerous illusion?
A really dangerous one, yeah.
What if the true force reshaping the human map, like the thing actually emptying out villages and pushing millions of people into overcrowded cities, is entirely invisible?
It's a completely silent force. I mean, there are no sirens. There are no dramatic helicopter rescues.
No sudden, violent destruction of property on the evening news.
Right, just a quiet, relentless pressure that is fundamentally redrawing the geographical boundaries of human settlement, while the rest of the world just looks the other way.
So, welcome to this deep dive. Today, our mission is to unpack something truly groundbreaking. We are looking at this exhaustive 21-year longitudinal study out of rural Pakistan, which was published in Nature Climate Change.
And it is a massive study.
Massive. And over the course of our conversation today, we're going to reveal why the disasters that make the evening news, the ones that get all the global attention and funding, aren't actually the ones causing permanent migration.
They really aren't.
Instead, we're going to expose the silent killer that is forcing millions to make a one-way trip away from home.
And by the time we're done here, I can promise you that pretty much everything you thought you knew about climate refugees or about how human beings respond to natural disasters.
Even about how personal wealth protects you in a crisis.
Yes, exactly. All of it is going to be completely turned upside down.
I have to admit, when I first started looking through the sources we gathered for this, like the data tables, the historical tracking, the economic breakdowns, my understanding of human survival instincts was just completely shattered.
It really is a face slap moment when you look at the raw numbers.
It is, because we all think we know how we'd react in a crisis, right?
Right.
We assume it's this simple equation of, danger equals flight.
But the numbers tell a profoundly different, much more complicated story.
So to understand why people actually leave their homes forever, we first have to look at the disasters that, surprisingly, keep them locked in place.
Right. And to really grasp that paradox, we need to examine the 2010 Pakistan floods.
Which was just massive.
Unbelievable scale. This serves as the perfect baseline case study for our discussion today because the sheer size of the event was staggering. We're not talking about a local river breaching its banks, We are talking about a mega disaster that altered the landscape of an entire nation.
The numbers are almost hard to comprehend, honestly. Like in the late summer of 2010, following these unusually heavy monsoon rains, the Indus River basin flooded on a scale rarely seen in modern history. The waters affected 20 million people.
20 million. It's hard to even picture that.
Let that sink in for a second. 20 million individuals. That's basically the equivalent of the entire population of New York State suddenly finding themselves underwater.
Yeah, and the physical devastation totally matched the human toll. The floodwaters destroyed an estimated $1 billion in crop value.
$1 billion.
$1 billion, essentially wiping out the agricultural backbone of the affected regions. 14 million people were temporarily relocated. 200,000 people had to move into internal displacement camps funded by international donors.
And logically, if you're a farmer in that region and a giant wall of water destroys your town, wipes away your generational farm, and ruins $1 billion in local crops, you pack up and leave forever.
That's the assumption.
You'd look at the devastation and say, I am never dealing with this again. I am moving to the city. I am moving to higher ground. That's the basic human instinct we assume operates here.
Right, and that assumption underlies almost every global policy on climate migration. But this 21-year microstudy proves the exact opposite is true.
Which is wild.
It really is. And it's crucial to understand the methodology here, This isn't just a quick snapshot survey taken a month after the waters receded.
Because short-term surveys don't tell the whole story.
Exactly. The researchers tracked 4,428 individuals across 583 households over 2 decades, from 1991 all the way to 2012.
So they were watching these specific families grow, move, work, and survive through multiple different weather events over a whole generation.
Precisely. And when they ran the data on those 21 years, they found that extreme flooding has virtually zero impact on long-term outmigration.
Wait, zero?
Basically zero. In fact, the researchers looked at what they call within-village migration, which is people just moving to a different, perhaps slightly more elevated part of the same village, and they found that severe flooding actually caused a modest decline in both men and women moving locally.
A decline.
Yes, the flood literally anchored them to the spot.
Okay, my brain is having a really hard time processing the mechanics of this. If everything is destroyed, why are they staying?
It seems totally counterintuitive.
It really does. How does a disaster of that magnitude, a disaster that ruins $1 billion in livelihood, not trigger an epic long-term exodus?
It comes down to the very nature of the disaster itself and how the world reacts to it. Because floods are highly visible, they're photogenic.
Right, they make for great television.
Exactly. When a flood happens, the international news cameras are there, the devastation is obvious, and it triggers a massive, immediate influx of global cash.
I see.
The study notes that global donors spend about $4.6 billion a year on emergency relief for natural disasters.
That is a massive safety net just dropping out of the sky.
It is. And Pakistan's social protection programs, along with international relief efforts, have historically been highly responsive to flood victims. They bring in food, they set up those temporary camps we mentioned, and crucially, they provide funds and materials to help rebuild homes.
So they give them the means to rebuild right there.
Exactly. This massive wave of aid effectively acts as an economic anchor. It heavily subsidizes the cost of staying.
Ah, okay. Let me see if I'm getting the psychology of this. Because the disaster is so visually dramatic, it triggers human empathy on a global scale. We send billions of dollars because we want to help.
Right. The intention is entirely good.
But by sending all that money to help them rebuild their lives exactly where the disaster just happened, we are unintentionally manipulating their natural migration instincts.
Yes, exactly. It's what we can call the aid trap.
The aid trap.
Yeah. Generous, short-term flood relief absolutely saves lives in a moment. I mean, there is no questioning the moral necessity of keeping people from drowning or starving. But the unintended side effect is that it obstructs what the researchers call welfare-enhancing population movements.
Meaning, it stops people from leaving a bad situation.
Right. For millennia, the most basic human adaptation to a dangerous environment has been to simply walk away from it, to disperse the risk by moving somewhere else.
But the aid money basically builds a financial wall around the disaster zone, keeping everyone inside. If they leave, they forfeit the free food, the building materials, the cash handouts.
Exactly. The billions of dollars meant to save people actually prevent them from diversifying their risk. They rebuild the house on the exact same floodplain because the aid money pays for the bricks.
It's totally wild to think about.
Think about it. If that aid money wasn't there, they might have taken whatever small savings they had left and moved to a safer region. But the presence of massive, highly targeted relief creates an artificial incentive to stay in harm's way.
And once the relief dries up, the cameras leave, and the international community pats itself on the back for a job well done. Those families are still living in a highly vulnerable area.
Right, often with depleted assets, just waiting for the next flood to wipe them out again.
That is such a cruel paradox.
It really is.
Yep.
And it's why this long-term data is so vital. It forces us to look past our emotional reactions to disasters.
Because the short-term snapshot is misleading.
Entirely. Short-term surveys right after a flood might show millions of people displaced, and you get these huge headlines about climate refugees. But the 21-year tracking shows they eventually go right back.
So the flood didn't cause permanent migration at all.
No, it just caused a temporary, highly subsidized disruption.
The very act of saving them is locking them into a cycle of vulnerability. I mean, we are essentially paying them to stay in the crosshairs of nature.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so if a biblical flood that destroys $1 billion in crops doesn't make people abandon their villages forever, what on earth does? What force is actually powerful enough to break that deep-seated attachment to home and overcome the gravity of international aid?
This brings us to the invisible villain of the story, the true driver of long-term climate migration.
Which is?
Heat stress.
Heat stress, no sirens, no dramatic news footage.
Just a slow, suffocating, relentless rise in the thermometer.
Yeah.
uncharacteristically high temperatures over a prolonged period. It is a completely untelevised crisis.
Let's get into the mechanics of how the scientists actually proved this, because it's fascinating. They didn't just walk into a village and ask people, hey, did you move to the city because you're feeling a bit too warm?
No, obviously not.
They had to use incredibly complex tracking to isolate the heat from a million other variables.
The methodology is what makes this paper a landmark study. Remember, they tracked over 4,400 individuals. They created what economists and sociologists call a person-year data set.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
Well, they tracked these individuals starting from a baseline, or when they reached age 15, and excluded them from the data pool after they migrated or when they turned 40.
Why kept it at 40? That seems specific.
Because demographic history shows that migration rates are incredibly low outside that 15 to 39 age bracket.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, people older than 40 rarely start entirely new lives in distant cities, especially in this context. By focusing on that prime working age window, they generated nearly 45,000 data points of individual human years.
That is an insane level of granular detail.
Right.
They are tracking the most economically productive years of these people's lives year by year to see exactly when they hit their breaking point.
Exactly. And then they took that massive human data set and overlaid it with highly detailed satellite-derived measures of climate variability.
So they looked at the weather data for every single year.
Right. They looked at cumulative rainfall during the monsoon season. They looked at average temperatures during the crucial Rabi season.
Which is what, exactly?
The Rabi season is from November to April, the primary growing season for wheat in Pakistan. They also looked at a 12-month moisture index.
And then they had to put all of that into a statistical blender. In the sources, it mentions they ran this through discrete time event history models, which sounds incredibly intimidating.
It does sound like a mouthful, but the concept is actually quite elegant.
Okay, break it down for us.
Imagine you have a giant sieve. You want to sift out sand to find a specific type of pebble. The discrete time event history model is just a mathematical sieve designed to filter out every other possible reason someone might move, leaving only the weather.
So they have to account for the fact that maybe a guy moved because his family is rich, or because his specific village got a new highway, or, because the national economy was booming that year.
Exactly. They controlled for the baseline wealth of the household in 1991. They controlled for the demographic makeup of the family, like how many siblings, ages, education levels.
Wow, they really looked at everything.
They did. They controlled for the specific village they lived in to account for local geography. They even controlled for the specific year to filter out nationwide economic trends or political events.
So they basically created a sterile laboratory environment within the data.
Yes, precisely to see exactly how weather, and only weather, affected the decision to leave forever.
They stripped away all the noise, and what was left standing?
A total statistical revelation. They grouped the weather data into quartiles, meaning they divided the historical temperature and rainfall data into 4 buckets.
The bottom 25%, the middle 50%, and the top 25%.
Right. And they focused intensely on the extremes, particularly Q4, the 4th quartile.
The absolute hottest and driest periods.
Yes. And they found that when temperatures hit that top 25% extreme, prolonged heat stress, the long-term migration of men completely skyrockets.
Let's look at the actual probabilities here, because the jump is terrifying. Under normal weather conditions, when temperature and rainfall are in the middle, comfortable ranges, what is the baseline chance of a rural Pakistani man permanently leaving his village in a given year?
It's incredibly low. The probability is just 0.01.
1%.
A 1% chance. Under normal conditions, people overwhelmingly want to stay home. They're tied to their land, their community, their family.
1%. So if you have 100 young men in a village, maybe one of them decides to try his luck in the city that year. But then the invisible killer arrives.
Right.
The temperature rises into that extreme Q4 hot scenario, while rainfall drops into the Q1 extreme low scenario, a severe hot drought. What happens to that 1% baseline?
It violently spikes. The probability leaps from 0.01 to 0.12.
12%.
That is a 12% probability. The likelihood of a man packing a bag and leaving the village forever becomes 12 times higher in absolute probability terms.
It's an explosion, going from 1 person leaving to 12 people leaving out of 100. I mean, that transforms a quiet village into a community actively hemorrhaging its young workforce.
And the researchers calculated the odds ratios to be absolutely sure. They found that a man's risk of migrating out of the village is more than 11 times higher The specific odds ratio is 11.1 sping when exposed to those Q4 extreme temperatures compared to normal conditions.
Over 11 times higher. And just to reiterate for you listening, because it's so important, this is after the mathematical sieve has filtered out everything else.
Everything.
This isn't because the national economy tanked or because there was a war. This is purely mathematically driven by the heat, the temperature rises, and the men leave.
That is the undeniable causal link the study established.
It makes me think of an analogy.
Oh, let's hear it.
Imagine you're at a crowded nightclub. If a massive, violent brawl breaks out in the middle of the dance floor, that's the flood, right? Security rushes in, the lights come on, people scatter to the edges of the room. It's totally chaotic, but then the club management comes in, offers everyone free drinks, fixes the broken tables, and tells everyone it's safe. People kind of huddle by the bar, drink their free drinks, and stay in the building.
Right, the dramatic event ironically keeps them there because of the immediate overwhelming response.
Exactly. But heat stress isn't a brawl. Heat stress is, the invisible bouncer.
The invisible bouncer. I like that.
It's someone in the back room just slowly, silently turning up the thermostat. 1 degree, 2 degrees. No one notices at first. There's no panic, but eventually the air gets thick, people start sweating, it becomes physically deeply uncomfortable. And one by one, without making a scene, without calling for help, people just start heading for the exit. They can't stand to be inside anymore. Every degree the temperature rises, another family's eldest son is forced to walk out the door.
That is incredibly apt. And the crucial difference in your analogy is that when the invisible bouncer turns up the heat, the international community does not send $4.6 billion of free drinks to keep them in the club.
No free drinks for the heat.
None. The heat attracts almost zero relief. The international donors, sitting in air-conditioned offices in Geneva or New York, they don't see the silent rise in the thermometer as a disaster.
Because there's no rubble to photograph.
Precisely. So these families are entirely on their own, they receive no help, and so they have to fall back on their own private coping mechanisms.
Which means walking away.
Exactly.
So we've established that the invisible bouncer is clearing the room, but I want to dig into why the heat is so intolerable. Why does heat trigger this 11-fold exodus when a massive flood doesn't?
It's a great question.
Because it can't just be about the physical sensation of being hot. I mean, humans live in deserts. Humans have adapted to extreme climates all over the world. What is the heat actually destroying that forces them to leave?
It's destroying the very foundation of their survival, their economy.
The economy?
Yes.
Yeah.
The heat attacks the agricultural ecosystem with a surgical precision that a flood just doesn't match.
Let's unpack the mechanics of this economic collapse. The researchers didn't just track migration. They also tracked exactly what happened to these families' incomes from 1986 to 1991 during different weather extremes, right?
Right. They knew heat caused migration, but they needed to prove how the mechanism worked. They wanted to see the exact financial trigger.
So what did they look at?
So they looked at 3 distinct streams of income for these households. Net farm income, farm wage income, which is money earned by working on someone else's farm, and non-farm income. And the results they found are absolutely devastating.
Let's start with the farm itself. In 2010, the study notes that uncharacteristically high temperatures caused the wheat grains to mature too early.
This is a critical biological detail. During the Rabi season, which spans the cooler months, wheat requires a very specific temperature window to develop properly.
Okay.
If the temperature spikes too high, too fast, the plant enters a state of biological panic.
Biological panic?
Yeah, it essentially realizes it's going to die from the heat, so it rushes to drop its seeds to reproduce before it perishes.
Oh, wow. So it speeds up the whole process.
Exactly. It matures early, but because it rushed the process, the grains are tiny, shriveled, and nutritionally poor. The yield is heavily reduced.
So they still get a crop, but it's basically worthless.
In 2010, that specific heat stress slashed Pakistani wheat yields by 13% overall nationally.
13% of an entire nation's yield just gone into the hot air.
And at the micro level, for these specific 583 households the study tracked, the financial impact was exponentially worse.
Let's hear the numbers.
The researchers found that when the temperature hits that top 25% extreme, a Q4 heat, it literally vaporizes more than 1/3 of a farming family's net income.
Over a third. That is massive.
The exact data point is staggering when you think about it in real terms. The average net farm income in their baseline was about 44,150 rupees. When exposed to Q4 temperature extremes, that income dropped by 15,890 rupees.
15,000 rupees just gone. Over a third of your livelihood vanished.
A sudden, unrecoverable loss. And remember, there is no international aid coming to replace those 15,000 rupees. The family simply has to absorb that blow.
Okay, let me push back on this a little bit.
Sure.
Because I understand the crops died, the wheat shriveled, and you lost a third of your farming income. That's a terrible year. But why leave the whole region?
What do you mean?
Well, if farming is failing this year, why not just go to the local town? Get a job at a mechanic shop or work in a restaurant or do construction in the village center until the next planting season. Why does a bad harvest trigger a massive long-distance exodus?
That is the exact assumption many policymakers make. They assume the broader local economy, shops, the trades, the services, acts as a buffer against agricultural failure.
Right, because not everyone is a farmer.
But the data completely shatters this assumption. The heat doesn't just kill the plants, it kills the entire local economic ecosystem.
Wait, so if the farmer goes bankrupt, everyone goes bankrupt?
Precisely. The researchers looked closely at non-farm income. You would logically think non-farm income, working at a retail shop, driving a delivery truck, fixing engines, would be relatively immune to the weather.
Yeah, a mechanic doesn't rely on rain to fix a tractor, right?
Exactly. But during extreme Q4 heat, rural non-farm income also dropped by 4,900 rupees.
Wow.
That's a 16% drop from the baseline.
A 16% drop in jobs that have nothing to do with farming. How? How does a drought close a mechanic shop?
Because of the chain of economic dependency in these rural areas, the entire rural economy is built around and funded by the farm.
Okay, the farm is the engine.
Yes. When the farmers lose 1/3 of their income, their disposable cash drops to zero. They stop buying new clothes for their children. They stop eating at the local tea stall.
Right, they tighten their belts.
They delay repairing their tractor because they don't have a crop to harvest anyway. They don't hire the local laborers to build an extension on their house. The purchasing power of the entire region just evaporates.
It's a domino effect. The farmer's bankruptcy instantly becomes the shopkeeper's bankruptcy.
As the study notes, when farmers are hit by a shock, the livelihoods of those dependent on providing goods and services to them will also be affected. The heat starves the root of the economic tree, and every single branch, the mechanic, the tailor, the grocer, dies with it.
So there is simply no local refuge.
None. The mechanic in town cannot hire you to sweep his shop because he's about to go out of business himself.
So the invisible bouncer didn't just make the dance floor uncomfortable. He shut down the bar, he turned off the music, and he fired the entire staff.
Yes.
There is literally nothing left to stay for.
Which brings up a fascinating contrast that the researchers highlighted. A massive plot twist regarding how we instinctively view weather.
Okay, what is it?
We've talked about heat, and we've talked about floods. But what about just heavy rain? Not a catastrophic infrastructure-destroying flood, but Q4 extreme rainfall.
Right. Usually when we hear extreme rainfall in the news, we brace for the worst. We assume it means washed out dirt roads, mudslides, ruined crops. We generally think of heavy rain as a negative event.
But the data tells a radically different story. Table 2 of the study lays this out with crystal clarity. While extreme heat vaporizes income, high rainfall in the top quartile actually massively boosts both farm and non-farm income.
Wait, really? It acts as an economic stimulus?
A massive one.
What?
When they hit Q4 rainfall, net farm income didn't drop. It increased by almost 14,000 rupees.
Unbelievable.
And non-farm income surged by over 15,000 rupees.
That is incredible. So rain is wealth and heat is bankruptcy.
Rain is the ultimate stimulus check for a rural economy. Even if it causes some local logistical problems or minor flooding, the sheer volume of biological growth it triggers translates directly into a massive economic boom.
The plants just explode with growth.
Yes. The crops thrive. The farmers have bumper harvests, so they hire more laborers. They buy more goods. They fix their equipment. The local shops thrive. This is why the study found that high moisture is heavily associated with the retention of household members.
Because when it rains, nobody wants to leave.
Exactly. Nobody wants to leave because that is when the money is made.
It really paints a vivid, terrifying picture of the heat scenario. Extreme heat provides a double negative shock, no crop to sell, and no secondary local jobs to fall back on.
And, as we established, zero international aid to soften the blow.
Right, so the local economy has collapsed. The family is sitting around an empty table staring at dried up, cracked fields. The local shops are boarded up. How do they survive?
They have to run what we can call a survival algorithm.
A survival algorithm. I like that phrasing.
And this is where the study reveals a deeply complex, incredibly calculated response to the crisis. It is not a panicked, chaotic stampede out of the village. It is a highly structured, strategic deployment of human assets.
Okay, how does it work?
And the results are entirely, strictly split by gender.
Oh, wow. Let's explore how this works. When the heat becomes unbearable and the money runs out, the destinies of men and women within these households fork completely.
Completely. The researchers used those complex mathematical models to separate not just who left the household, but exactly where they went.
And what were the categories?
They categorized moves as either in village, meaning staying local, perhaps moving to a neighboring community, or out of village, which means long-distance migration, moving to a major city, or even abroad.
And the divergence is stark. Let's look at the men first. What is the men's route when the heat hits?
The men take the long road. We saw earlier that their overall probability of leaving jumps from 1% to 12%, an 11-fold increase. But crucially, almost all of that movement is out of village.
So they are leaving the local economic zone entirely.
Exactly.
Because, as we just established, the local economy is dead. If I'm a young man in this village, finding a job in the next town over doesn't work if the next town is also suffering from the same exact drought.
Right, the drought covers the whole region.
My gut tells me they aren't just wandering aimlessly. They have to travel far enough to reach a completely different economic system.
You hit the nail on the head. They are acting as financial scouts. They must migrate far enough to reach an urban center, places like Karachi or Lahore, where the economy is based on industry, manufacturing, or urban services.
Places that don't care if it rained or not.
Exactly. Those urban economies are relatively insulated from local agricultural weather shocks.
So they find construction jobs, factory work, whatever they can get.
Whatever pays cash. And their primary function once they get there becomes sending remittances cash back to the family that stayed behind.
It's a classic income diversification strategy.
Yes. The farm might produce absolutely zero this year, but the son in the city is sending back enough cash every month to buy food and keep the family alive.
Okay, so the men are deployed across vast distances to capture non-agricultural cash. But what about the women?
This is where it gets really interesting.
Because if the goal is risk diversification, my guess is they aren't just following the men to the cities. Putting everyone in the same urban area in the same economic bracket is just trading one fragile basket for another.
That's exactly right. The data shows that when women migrate during these climate shocks, it's primarily in village or to neighboring local areas. They are not making the long-distance trek to the urban centers.
So they are staying close. Why? Is it purely cultural tradition? Is it because the journey to the city is deemed too dangerous or inappropriate for unaccompanied women?
Culture certainly dictates the mechanics of how they move, but the researchers highlight a deeply strategic, life-saving financial motive behind this pattern.
Okay.
Women in this context migrate locally primarily through marriage. And in times of severe climate stress, this local marriage migration acts as an ingenious, desperate financial safety net for the broader family.
Wait, unpack this for me. How does a local marriage protect a family against a severe drought?
The researchers cite compelling earlier evidence of this exact dynamic in rural India. By marrying daughters into families in neighboring villages or different parts of the local region, the core family is weaving a localized web of connections.
A network.
A risk-sharing network.
So it is essentially agricultural risk diversification.
Precisely. Rainfall and heat can be incredibly localized. Your specific patch of land might fail because of a microdrought, or your specific crop gets wiped out by a pest exacerbated by the heat.
But the next village over might be fine.
Yes. Your daughter's new family, who might be farming 5 miles away, perhaps near a more reliable river, or growing a slightly different, more heat-tolerant crop, they might still have food.
It's an alliance. You're basically linking two balance sheets together.
It is entirely an economic and survival alliance. The two families are now tied by blood, honor, and mutual obligation. If your farm fails, you can borrow grain from your in-laws. They can shelter your livestock until the drought passes. The men are sent far away to capture entirely new urban income. The women are sent locally to weave a tighter, more resilient agricultural safety net across the immediate geography.
That completely reframes how I view climate migration. I mean, it's so easy sitting in the West to look at this issue and just see tragedy. to see passive, fleeing victims scattered by the wind.
Right, the helpless narrative.
Exactly. But what you're describing is a highly sophisticated, deeply rational economic strategy. These are incredibly vulnerable families running a complex cost-benefit analysis on the fly, diversifying their portfolios the only way they possibly can.
By physically moving their family members to different geographic and economic zones.
It is a profound act of resilience and strategy. Every time a young man boards a bus for a distant city or a young woman marries into a neighboring village during a drought, you aren't just seeing a family breaking apart under pressure.
You're seeing a family executing a deeply calculated survival algorithm to ensure the survival of the whole.
It is brilliant, and, it's heartbreaking that they are forced to do it. So we know why people leave. The invisible heat vaporizes their income. We know where they go based on their men far, women local.
Yep.
But that leaves perhaps the most crucial question of all. Who exactly is packing their bags? Which families are making these moves?
And once again, the data here is going to completely contradict our basic assumptions.
Because my immediate assumption, and I think the assumption of most people listening to this, is that moving requires capital. Moving is expensive.
It certainly is.
You need money for bus tickets. You need money for a security deposit on an apartment in a new city. You need savings to feed yourself while you walk the streets looking for work.
Right.
So logically, the people fleeing the climate crisis must be the relatively wealthy ones, right? The middle-class farmers with some savings in the bank. Surely the absolute poorest people, the ones with nothing, are just stuck, unable to afford the basic cost of escape.
That is the perfectly logical assumption. But Table 3 of this study drops what might be the heaviest, most counterintuitive finding of this entire deep dive.
Lay it on us.
The researchers cross-referenced the migration data with land ownership and asset wealth, and they found that the people who flee the most, by a massive, statistically overwhelming margin, are the absolute poorest.
Wait, the people with nothing?
The completely landless. The people in the lowest tercile, the bottom third of asset wealth. When exposed to Q4 extreme heat stress, the odds of a landless person migrating out of the village are almost 5 times higher than their wealthier neighbors.
5 times higher.
The odds ratio is 4.89, which is a massive statistical spike.
I'm almost 5 times higher for the poorest of the poor. But how? How do they afford to leave if they have zero assets?
To understand this, we have to look at it from the other side. It's less about how the poor afford to leave and more about why the wealthy cannot leave.
Oh, why are the rich staying put while the poor scatter to the winds? Because if the local economy is dead, shouldn't the rich landlord just take his savings and go to a nice apartment in Lahore where there's air conditioning?
Well, think about your own life for a second. If an economic crisis hits, the advice is always to have assets, right? Own a home, own property. We're told wealth equals freedom and security.
Always.
But in this specific climate scenario, that conventional wisdom is totally inverted. We have to look at what constitutes wealth in rural Pakistan. It is not a diversified stock portfolio or a fat savings account.
What is it?
It's land. It's a tractor. It's a herd of cattle. It's expensive irrigation equipment.
Tangible, heavy, physical things.
Exactly. Illiquid assets.
Yeah.
And in the middle of a severe, searing drought, when the temperature is 115 degrees and the crops are dying,
Yeah.
you cannot sell a field of dead wheat.
Nobody's going to buy that.
You cannot liquidate cracked, dry earth. Nobody's buying. If you are a landowner and you leave for the city, you are abandoning the source of your wealth.
And if you leave it?
Untended land can be squatted on or stolen. Unused equipment degrades in the heat or gets looted. Animals die if they aren't watered daily.
So their wealth, which usually acts as a protective moat around their family, suddenly becomes a pair of heavy iron shackles.
That is the perfect way to phrase it. The study explicitly notes that the poor actually have more locational flexibility because they are not tied down to land or assets that are hard to sell and at extreme risk of loss if left untended.
Wow.
The rich are chained to their dying farms. They have to sit in the sweltering heat and weather the storm to protect their physical capital.
That is an incredible reversal. We always think of poverty as a trap. But in this specific climate scenario, poverty provides the ultimate brutal form of mobility. If you own absolutely nothing, you have nothing to lose by walking away.
And this creates a devastating chain of suffering down the rural socioeconomic ladder. We need to look at the ecology of this local economy. How do the landless poor survive in normal, healthy years?
Well, they work for those rich landlords. They're the farm laborers, the sharecroppers, the maids, the guys who fix the tractors.
Precisely. Now imagine extreme heat hits. The wheat shrivels. The landlord loses a third of his net income. Does the landlord starve?
Probably not.
No. The landlord still has savings, maybe some stored grain from last year. He will survive the year. He doesn't leave because he has to protect the land. But what is the very first thing that landlord does to cut his operating costs when his income drops by a third?
Oh, he fires all the workers.
Immediately. He doesn't need 50 people to harvest a ruined crop. He only needs 10. He doesn't need the tractor repaired if he's not driving it. So in an instant, the landless worker's income drops from something to absolute zero.
So the heat destroyed the landlord's profit, but it destroyed the laborer's actual day-to-day survival.
The landlord takes a financial haircut, but the laborer gets decapitated.
That is so dark.
Exactly. The poor are entirely dependent on the trickle-down wealth of the agricultural cycle. The study highlights this dynamic clearly. Given that the poor often provide goods and services to land cultivators, when farmers are hit by a shock, the livelihoods of those dependent on providing goods and services to them will also be affected.
It's a bottom feeder collapse. The people at the very bottom of the food chain feel the shockwave first, and they feel it the hardest.
And because they have zero assets to sell and zero wages coming in and no land holding them down, they're the ones who are violently ejected from the economic system.
Because they have literally no other choice.
Right. The mathematical calculation for a landless laborer isn't, can I afford the bus ticket to Karachi? The calculation is, if I stay in this village for another week, my children will literally starve to death.
So the migration benefits instantly outweigh the moving costs.
Exactly. So they borrow the money from a loan shark, they sell the clothes off their back, and they run. They become the absolute vanguard of the climate exodus.
That completely reframes who a climate refugee actually is. It is not a broad representative cross-section of a society. It's a highly concentrated distillation of the most profoundly vulnerable, asset-stripped people on Earth.
Pushed out by a silent economic collapse.
While the wealthier landowners are forced to sit in the heat and guard the dirt.
It is a dark, brutal reality of how climate change actually operates on the ground. It does not affect everyone equally. It is surgical in its targeting of the poor.
Okay, so if we know the heat is targeting the absolute poorest people, and we know exactly why they are running, how on earth are global governments missing this? Because clearly the $4.6 billion we talked about earlier isn't going to them.
That brings us to the massive systemic problem at the heart of this issue. The global policy blind spot.
Because the world has to be reacting somehow, right?
The short answer to how the world is handling this is terribly. We are essentially fighting the wrong war, using the wrong weapons.
Let's trace where that money actually goes.
Almost all of that $4.6 billion, historically and globally, goes to the visible photogenic disasters we talked about at the beginning. The typhoons in the Philippines, the hurricanes in the Caribbean, the massive floods in Pakistan.
The disasters that destroy buildings and bridges, the physical, sudden violence.
Because it's easy to mobilize political will and donor money when you can point to a collapsed elementary school on CNN and say, we need to rebuild that.
Exactly.
But the invisible, silent, creeping heat wave, the slow evaporation of 33% of a rural economy over 5 agonizingly hot months, it gets essentially nothing.
Nothing at all.
It has a massive blind spot in global policy because it doesn't look like an emergency.
Right. You cannot take a compelling photograph of a 13% drop in wheat yield. It just looks like a slightly shorter field of wheat. You cannot take a picture of a mechanic shop slowly going bankrupt over 6 months because the local farmer stopped spending money.
Exactly. It's boring television.
But for the people living it, it is an apocalyptic reality.
And this is the crux of the author's argument in this paper. They are making a desperate plea for a total policy overhaul. The current global aid system is completely reactive, and it is reacting to the wrong metric.
So what are we doing instead?
We are providing what we might call blood transfusions.
I love that analogy. Emergency post-disaster aid. You wait until the patient is bleeding out on the operating table, the flood has already happened, and you pump them full of casts, bottled water, and temporary shelters.
But as we discussed earlier with the aid trap, that transfusion often just keeps people tied to the danger zone.
Right. It's a localized, temporary fix that actually prevents long-term adaptation.
What the researchers say we desperately need to do is stop waiting for the trauma to happen and start building immunity.
Immunity, I like that.
We need sustainable development that addresses the actual driver of long-term misery, the weather-related risks to the agricultural economy.
So practically speaking, what does building immunity look like according to the data in this study? If throwing $4.6 billion at flood camps is the wrong move, where should that money be redirected?
They outline three major structural pivots. First, we have to fundamentally alter the crops themselves. We need to shift relief money toward massive investments in heat-resistant crop varieties.
Which tackles the problem at the absolute root.
Exactly. If the global temperature is going to rise, and it is, the wheat needs to be able to survive it.
Right. If we engineer wheat that doesn't panic and prematurely mature during a Q4 heat spike, then the farmer's yield doesn't drop.
And if the yield doesn't drop, the farmer's income doesn't drop by a third.
And if the farmer's income stays stable, the mechanic stays in business.
And if the mechanic stays in business, the landless laborer doesn't get fired and doesn't have to flee to Karachi.
You stop the domino effect at the very first piece, the seed. That makes perfect sense. What's the second pivot?
The second is financial resilience. Specifically, producing and disseminating much better weather forecasting data to remote areas, and crucially, implementing widespread weather insurance.
How does weather insurance change the game? I mean, poor farmers buying insurance sounds difficult.
Well, right now, when the heat hits, the farmer absorbs 100% of the shock. It completely vaporizes their personal wealth for the year. If they had accessible, heavily subsidized, and affordable weather insurance, a disastrously hot season wouldn't mean immediate starvation and mass layoffs.
It would mean an insurance payout.
Exactly. That payout replaces the lost crop revenue, which means the farmer can still afford to buy goods, which keeps the local economy breathing until the next planting season.
You smooth out the volatility. The heat spike doesn't become an automatic death sentence for the town's commerce. That's huge. Okay, what is the third recommendation?
The third is perhaps the most counterintuitive policy recommendation of all, especially given the current state of global politics.
Okay, brace me.
The authors argue that we must enact policies that actively encourage welfare-enhancing migratory responses. We must lower the barriers to migration.
Wow. Let me just sit with that.
Yeah.
So instead of viewing migration as a failure of policy or a crisis to be stopped at the border, we need to view it as a solution.
Yes. The study explicitly states that migration is an individual's attempt to adapt to an array of weather-related risks. It is a deeply rational survival mechanism.
But right now, migrants face massive hurdles.
Huge hurdles. Exploitation, lack of legal protections, dangerous journeys, predatory loan sharks, and systemic resistance from the urban centers or countries they are trying to reach.
That is a staggering paradigm shift. I mean, the global political narrative right now, almost everywhere, is intensely focused on building walls. Hard borders, preventing movement, keeping people exactly where they are.
Very much so.
But the science, the hard data from a 21-year deep dive, is saying that movement is the ultimate natural human adaptation strategy.
It always has been.
And instead of spending billions of dollars to trap people in floodplains or building walls to keep them out of cities, we should actually be greasing the wheels. We should be helping them move smoothly and safely, because forcing them to stay put is a death sentence.
Exactly. When the invisible bouncer turns up the heat, the ethical and logical response is not to lock the doors of the club to keep everyone inside.
Right.
The logical response is to open up more exits, make sure the hallways are well lit, and help people find a cooler place to go.
That is profound. It really requires us to dismantle almost every preconceived notion we have about disaster, charity, economics, and borders.
And that is exactly what this long-term, granular data demands we do. We cannot keep applying short-term emotional fixes to long-term structural shifts.
Let's try to pull all of this together because we've covered an immense amount of ground today. This journey through the data has been absolutely jaw-dropping.
It's a lot to take in, for sure.
We started with the shocking realization that the epic, violent disasters, the biblical floods that affect 20 million people, don't actually force people to leave their homes permanently.
Because the world responds to those loud, photogenic disasters with billions of dollars in immediate aid.
Which acts as a financial anchor that inadvertently traps people in highly vulnerable areas.
A well-intentioned but ultimately highly restrictive aid trap.
Then we uncovered the true driver of mass displacement, the silent killer, heat stress. When temperatures spike into that extreme top 25%, the long-term migration of men skyrockets by a factor of 11. The invisible bouncer turns up the heat, and people are forced to flee.
Forced to flee because the heat surgically destroys the local agricultural economy.
It vaporizes over a third of the net farm income.
Which then causes a devastating domino effect, collapsing the non-farm income by 16%. The whole region simply runs out of money.
And when that happens, families deploy a brilliant, heartbreaking survival algorithm. The men take the long road to the distant cities to find wage labor and send back cash.
And the women stay closer, weaving a vital local safety net through marriage to diversify the family's agricultural risk across different microclimates.
And the people executing this algorithm, the ones actually flooding the roads, are not the ones who can easily afford it. The data proves that the absolute poorest, the landless laborers, are nearly 5 times more likely to be forced out,
They are violently ejected from the bottom of the economic food chain.
while the wealthy landlords are cursed by their own illiquid assets, chained to dying farms they cannot sell.
It is a complete inversion of how we view wealth and mobility. Poverty provides the only liquidity.
And it points to a massive, multi-billion-dollar policy blind spot. We are spending all our money reacting to the visible floods and completely ignoring the silent heat wave that is actually redrawing the map.
We need to stop the emergency blood transfusions and start building structural immunity.
With heat-resistant crops, weather insurance, and most importantly, by embracing and facilitating human migration rather than fighting it.
It is a clear mandate for a total rethink of our global adaptation strategy.
And to you, the listener, I want to leave you with this thought. We have spent this entire deep dive looking at incredibly specific data from rural Pakistan between 1991 and 2012. But make no mistake, Pakistan is not an isolated anomaly.
No, Pakistan is a preview.
It is a crystal clear window into the future of the entire globe. As global average temperatures relentlessly rise year after year, these exact same invisible pressures, the silent economic strangulation, are currently squeezing rural communities in Central America, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia, and even in the agricultural heartlands of Europe and North America.
Millions of people are quietly being pushed out of the countryside and into rapidly expanding urban centers.
Not by dramatic screaming storms that make the front page of the paper, but by a quiet, relentless daily heat. The human map is being redrawn right now, every single day, not by a tidal wave, but by a silent thermometer.
It's happening as we speak.
Which brings us to a final haunting question. Something I want you to chew on long after you finish listening to this. We saw how the $4.6 billion in disaster aid ironically acted as an anchor, keeping people trapped in floodplains instead of allowing them to naturally migrate to safety.
Right.
If our global charity, our massive international aid budgets, and our social safety nets are currently designed to aggressively rebuild homes in the exact locations where nature just tried to destroy them, are we actually saving people? Or are we just paying to keep them locked inside a burning building?
That is the ultimate question we have to answer before the heat rises any further.
Think about that. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.